Again, welcome Daniel Hahn. He's going to speak on the evolution of policing and public safety in a time of social unrest. We're fortunate to have Daniel Hahn today. He retired as Sacramento's chief of police last year after 34 years in law enforcement. Mr. Hahn is from Sacramento, growing up in Oak Park. As a child, he witnessed violence, including a murder when he was just 9 years old. He was no mere observer of crime. He was arrested himself for resisting an officer when he was all of 16 years old. Mr. Hahn joined the Sacramento Police Department as community service officer in 1987, rising to captain. Among his many duties, he served as public information officer, high school criminal justice academy coordinator, watch commander, special investigations commander, patrol commander, and personnel division commander. Mr. Hahn left the Sacramento Police Department to become Roseville's first African-American peace officer, and in 2011, he was appointed as Roseville's chief of police, also a first for an African-American. In 2017, he returned to Sacramento, but this time as chief of police. He led the department through a time of unprecedented social unrest and changes in public safety policy and practice. Mr. Hahn holds a bachelor's in business administration from Sac State and a master's of public administration from National University. He is an adjunct professor at Sac State in the Criminal Justice Department, teaching such courses as Police and Society and Public Safety Leadership. He's also the new division dean of the Department of the Administration of Justice at American River College. He's in demand as a speaker. He gives presentations on history and bias that he developed through years of his own research. Today, Mr. Hahn is going to talk about the evolution of policing and public safety. Daniel Hahn, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but I will definitely leave some time at the end in case anyone has any questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. I can't guarantee you'll like the answer, but I guarantee you I'll answer it. So welcome. It's my pleasure and honor to be here with all of you, and hopefully this will provide you some information that maybe you didn't have before today. So I just want to start off a little bit about myself so you can kind of have some insight of where I'm coming from with my belief system. So I was born at Mercy Hospital on J Street and immediately given up for adoption. I've since figured out who my biological family was, and I've met and had a great relationship with my biological father starting in 1992. And he passed away 15 years ago. And so I'm still have a close relationship with my biological father's side of the family. So my mom and dad adopted me when I was 3 months old. So I often say it's the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, that the greatest thing that's ever happened to you happened when you were 3 months old. So I guess it's downhill from there. But my mom is from a farming community in Minnesota called Painesville, Minnesota. If you Google it now, it's probably like, I think last time I Googled it a few months ago, it was population 1,200. And my father is from a small farming community in Nebraska. And prior to me being adopted, my brother was born and my sister was born. And my sister was born, my brother is 5 years older than me. My sister is 4 years older than me. My sister was born with hydrocephalus. So she has some fairly significant mental and physical disabilities. So my mom wanted 3 children, but the doctors told her that the chances of a 3rd child biologically would have a higher chance of having disabilities. So she and my dad decided that maybe they would adopt a 3rd child. And at the time, my mom read a national magazine, I believe it was Time magazine, that had an article about adoption and which kids typically get placed in families. And the hardest to place in the article was kids with disabilities. And the second hardest to place in the 60s was kids that were mixed race. And so my mom wanted to adopt a child that might not otherwise be adopted. So, and my sister didn't like girls. So therefore I was adopted. Greatest thing that ever happened to me. Unfortunately, my dad died when I was 5. My brother was 10, my sister was 9, and my mom, with no family here in Sacramento, is raising me, my brother, and my sister. And so I grew up at the corner of 33rd and 2nd Avenue in Oak Park. And at the time, Oak Park was probably the most active neighborhood in Sacramento in terms of crime. The first street gang in Sacramento started in Oak Park when I was basically in middle school. And we lived right off the stroll where women were being trafficked daily, right off of Broadway there. And so near the end of my youth, it was the start of the crack epidemic. So crack had a devastating impact on Oak Park that was already in with many, many challenges. And so I saw drug dealing, drug use, violence pretty much every day. When I think this was mentioned in the intro, when I was 9 years old, well, let me back up. My mom was the organist of the church and the choir director. Our church was Oak Park United Church of Christ, which was like 2 blocks from our house. We'd walk to church. And so I would run home after church to sneak some TV in to watch football. And so one Sunday, my older brother and I were there. And by this point, my mom remarried to my stepfather, which brought 2 more brothers. My stepfather died when I was 16, but back when I was 9 years old, we heard some gunshots outside the house right after we got home from church. And so my older brother and I look out the window and we watch a guy get shot, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 or 10 times. And he collapsed in front of the liquor store across the street. So I ran down the steps of our house and ran across the street and basically stood over him as he crawled into the liquor store and crawled back out and then collapsed on the sidewalk in front of the liquor store, and pretty much watched him die when I was 9. So a couple of years later, when I'm in middle school at Kit Carson, my mom told me to wear my church clothes to school and picked me up about halfway through the school day and took me down to Superior Courthouse, the same one that's where all the court hearings are done today and where I've testified many times as a police officer. At 11 years old, I testified as one of only 2 witnesses, my brother and I, in a jury murder trial. When I was 16, I was arrested for assault on an officer and resisting in the living room of my house after I got into a little disagreement over flunking chemistry at Sac High, and the police responded, and the result of that was me in juvenile hall. Then I accidentally became a police officer, and accidentally, I mean, I never thought about being a police officer. In my neighborhood, police officers weren't thought of very highly. I think the first time I ran from a police officer, I was in the 3rd grade walking home from David Lubin Annex, which is on W Street in like 26 or something like that. And I jaywalked across Alhambra, and there was a police officer that I didn't see parked along the sidewalk about half block up that twerped his siren and said, "Come here." And well, the last thing I was going to do is have a police officer take me home to my mom. So I took off running. I got away. I was faster than the officer. So, police officers weren't, we didn't know any police officers. We didn't have any friends whose parents were police officers or family or anything. Police officers weren't well thought of. So I didn't hate police officers. I'd never even crossed my mind to be a police officer. But when I was at City College, my first year out of high school, I took a criminal justice class because a friend of mine told me it was easy and it sufficed for a general ed. And I think I had chemistry that semester. I had a couple hard classes, so I was looking for some easy classes. And recruiters came by, and the only reason I eventually applied was because it paid $5 an hour more than I was making in Florin Mall. And my whole goal was, I was 18 years old. I was gonna, if I got hired, I would, because I applied for the post office, all sorts of jobs I didn't want, but paid good money. So my goal was, if I got hired, I would serve in the police department until I graduated from college, and I'd quit and go be a school teacher and start my own business because my degree is in business administration. So I applied and went through the process, and somehow they thought knucklehead Daniel Hahn was at least a decent choice for the academy. So I went to the academy. Fortunately, my roommate in the academy, it was live-in, was 53 years old, so he helped me a lot. By the time I went to the academy, I was 19. So you can't be a police officer when you're 19. So you can only be a community service officer. So the officers that drive around in the light blue shirts and take traffic accident reports and burglary reports, things like that, with no suspects. So I did that for 2 years. I was still at City College. And then when I turned 21, the department came to me and told me they would like to upgrade me to full police officer. And I can still remember I called my mom. I said, "Mom, I'm gonna be a cop." And she goes, "I thought you didn't want to be a cop." And I'm like, "Well, I don't, but you know, they're gonna pay me $14 an hour now as opposed to $8 an hour. So I'm gonna do that too till I graduate from college." But about 8 or 9 years in, when I graduated from college, I started doing community related jobs. So I was what we called the neighborhood police officer in Strawberry Manor up in Del Paso Heights, working closely with the elementary school and the families in the neighborhood. And then I started the Criminal Justice Academy at Grant High School and got a teaching credential and taught the academy as a police officer for 3 years and coached softball at Grant High School. And finally realized I can do what I love to do as a police officer. Because as a kid, I only saw police officers as people that drove around in black and white squad cars out in patrol and arrested people, because that's what I saw every day. I didn't know these other jobs and you could do all these different things in the police department that I love to do. See, my mom was a big community person. She was like, if you will, the Mother Teresa of our couple blocks, and she helped everybody. She gave our house that I grew up in, she gave for free to a family she knows that helps women escaping sex trafficking. She gave the house across the street that we owned away to the Habitat for Humanity. And every car we ever had, she's given away. So I didn't always appreciate it as a kid, but that's what I grew up. So I grew up being forced to go to community meetings, being forced to go to community functions. And somewhere in there, I guess it sunk in that that's what I love to do, is work with the community. So when I was able to start doing jobs that work closely with the community or teaching, like at Grant, I decided I would stay. And eventually I got harassed by mentors of mine to take promotion exams and things like that. So I started promoting up. And in 2011, I was a captain in the police department, and Roseville called me and the city manager wanted me to be his police chief. And well, I turned him down for like 2 months, but obviously eventually I went. And then in 2017, I had the opportunity to come home and be police chief in my home city. So that's a little bit about me. And last thing, in 1992, I went to the academy in 1987. So in 1992, I'm a fairly young police officer, and my younger brother had just returned the year earlier, not too long before this, from the Army. He had served in the Army and fought in Desert Storm, but he had gotten addicted to drugs. So he was living downtown at 19th and G, and he was selling drugs and doing drugs and who knows what else. And a couple of weeks before, I came in contact with his drug dealing partner, who had been beating what I assume was a girl that he was trafficking. And so about a week later, that same person killed my younger brother. And so it happened in his home at 19th and G, and the call came out while I was working, and that's my beat at the time. And so I responded to the call. I identified him, and I had to call my mom and tell her her youngest son had been murdered in downtown. And just probably 2 weeks earlier, I had called my mom and told her that Chris that's my younger brother, was kind of wilding out with drugs and things. And she had expressed a lot of frustration that she'd been trying to get him help and he just wouldn't go and all those sort of things. And I literally told her, this was the cop and me talking to her, not the brother and the son. I said, well, Chris is either going to end up in jail or dead if he keeps going down this road. And actually, both in the 2 weeks following that phone call, both actually happened. He had gotten arrested. His drug dealing partner got arrested. And the reason is the partner's name was Skip. And the reason he killed him is he thought Chris was snitching him off, probably to me. So he murdered him in his home. So unfortunately, I had to see that and call my mom. So that's a little background on me. I only have 2 slides, and then I'm gonna speak a little bit, and then there's a video if we have time, and then I'll open it up for questions. So let me, I wanted to, because too many times when we have conversations, the conversations are not based on facts, like proven facts. So I'm someone that likes to, if we're going to solve things, we need to know the truth, right? And we need to be open to listening to other people's opinions, but it has to be based on the truth, because if it's not, then we're working on something that's not really real. So I just wanted to put some stats up here because I think there's some interesting nuance to these stats, but also they're the truth, or at least as far as the polls can tell the truth, I guess. So if you remember, George Floyd was killed by a Minneapolis police officer on May 25th, 2020. So Gallup poll was taken the following couple months. So shortly after George Floyd. So all of you, I'm sure, clearly know the unrest in this country that occurred after the George Floyd murder. And so this is during that time. So it's while there's protests in every major city across this country. So in this poll, it found that, and there's a lot of defund police and abolish police movement going on at the time. So interesting enough, in the following months after George Floyd, 81% of African Americans in this poll wanted the police presence in their neighborhoods to increase or remain the same. So a little bit different than what we would hear in the news about all this defund the police movement. Well, 81% of the African American community didn't really want that. And I can tell you from my personal experience living in this city every day of my life, and growing up in Oak Park and working most of my career in Del Paso Heights and Meadowview, I've never heard a community member say they don't want the police around. They want the police to be better. That they say that frequently. They want the police to act differently and be better, but they don't say they want less police. Matter of fact, I've been told many times we need the police, but we need them to be better. So the nuance to that stat, though, is even though 81% feel that way, the ones that are very confident about receiving positive treatment by the police, only 18% of the African American community feel confident about receiving positive treatment. And it goes up from there. 24% of the Asian community, 40% of the Hispanic community, and 56% of the white community. So you see a wide range of different or opposite feelings depending on which segment of our communities you talk to. Loyola Marymount University does a study every year on Los Angeles and the Los Angeles Police Department. So both community and the police department specifically, and government in general. And so in their study that year, a few months after that, in 2020, same year, the questions was, are things in the city going in the right direction? Only 46% of Los Angeles said things were going in the right direction. One of the other questions was, how much of the time do you think you can trust the following groups to do what is right? So the largest percent of, or the group that people most frequently thought would do what is right are your neighbors. This is in LA. So people thought their neighbors would do what's right the most frequently. Second most was non-police alternatives. So it might be social workers or somebody else that's responding to calls. So that was 59%. Their local police officers, the ones that work their specific neighborhood, 57%. Los Angeles Police Department in general, 51%. The police unions, only 44%. And city government, only 44%. And the media came in at 40%. So, we a lot of times, not as much now as before, but we get our information from the media. And in Loyola Marymount's study, the media was the one they thought would do the right the least often. So we also, the Sacramento Police Department, I started a community and police survey shortly after the Stephon Clark shooting. So if you remember, Stephon Clark happened March 18th, 2018. So this study was in June or July of that same year. So a few months after the shooting. And if you remember, there were a lot of protests. It's the only time in the history of the National Basketball Association, the NBA, that a basketball game was shut down, was during the Stephon Clark protest. And it happened twice here in Sacramento. I-5 was taken over, and you probably remember those times. Well, in this survey, one of the questions was, how do you rate the police? How do you rate the police service? This is specific to Sacramento. 46% said very good, 33% said acceptable. So basically 79% say it's either acceptable or very good. I think that's higher than I would have thought right after the Stephon Clark shooting. 21% said poor, but the nuance is only 25% rated police service as good. So you see which segments of our society have the least amount of trust for police. Second question, how much trust do you have in the Sacramento Police Department? About 75% said some to complete or quite a bit. 25% said little or none. And then we also surveyed the officers, because this is a holistic solution. We need to understand how officers are feeling too. So how much trust do you, the officer, have in the residents of the area that you serve? So how much does that officer trust the community or the neighborhood that he or she works in? 71% said they have some to quite a bit of trust in the community that they specifically work in. So it might be Del Paso Heights, for example. But here's the nuance. The officers that worked in Del Paso Heights, only 27% of them had some to quite a bit of trust in Del Paso Heights. And Meadowview was the second lowest, which is where the Stephon Clark shooting occurred at, was 38% of the officers had some to quite a bit of trust. So even though the 71% is a fairly high number, when you go specifically to any particular neighborhood, especially some of our more impoverished neighborhoods, that number goes really down with police officers. So I just wanted to share that with you to kind of give you a sense. My guess is those numbers have probably gone up slightly since then, because that was right after George Floyd for the first slide, and right after Stephon Clark for the second slide. So the second thing I wanted to, well, I'll just talk a little bit about the protests for a second. Well, before I get to the protests, I'll say how some of the ways law enforcement has changed. So when I came on in 1987, police officers had a gun, a baton, and mace. That's pretty much all we had in terms of equipment, besides handcuffs and a shotgun in the car. Those are the tools that we had. So, but now if you look at any officer you see in a Sacramento Police Department car has a taser on their belt, has pepper ball, which basically has the same thing as pepper spray on their belt, but in little paintball pellets. They have a beanbag shotgun. They no longer have a regular shotgun. And they have access to, or in every trunk is a ballistic shield, a ballistic helmet. We did not have ballistic helmets when I came on. So they have a bunch of extra tools to handle things without deadly force. And I can tell you those things are used every single night. Most of the time you don't hear about them, but they're used every single night. Well, it wasn't even possible to use those things when I first came on because they didn't exist in our cars. And so technology has come a long ways. The drones now are used, whereas we maybe used to be able to, like in Stephon Clark, run into a backyard and chase after somebody. Now the officers will slow it down if appropriate and use drones to search a backyard. So it lessens the chance of a shooting because now you're seeing where the person is. It has a camera, it has infrared camera on it, has a light. Some drones actually can speak. So the operator can speak through the drone to the person that's hiding. We have robots. I'll give you an example. We had a call out kind of near where my in-laws live, off in Meadowview, off of Tangerine and La Mancha. And the call was a typical call that happens every single night. Sounds of gunfire in a neighborhood, right? No suspect description, nobody's seen anything. You're just in your house and you hear some gunfire. Those calls are every single night. And the vast majority of them, probably 99.9% of them, the officer responds, never finds anything. As it, like, either somebody did a drive-by or somebody just went out like on New Year's Eve and shot off rounds into the air. So it's a very routine call. So the officer is driving down the street and there's this gentleman walking down the sidewalk, not running, not acting suspicious, just walking down the sidewalk. So the officer pulls up alongside of him and you can tell the officer's getting out of his car to talk to this person. I would guess to probably ask him, hey, have you heard any gunfire? Well, the guy walks up to the passenger side of the officer's car and the passenger window was down, and he immediately, without saying anything, without any warning, pulls a gun out and shoots the officer before he can get out of his car, shoots him right in the side. Luckily, it hits about the bottom ½ inch of his bulletproof vest. So he returns fire, hits the guy collapses in the street, but he's still alive and still holding his gun. So for about the next hour, we used a drone and a robot to communicate with him and try to get him to move the gun away. And eventually we used the robot to go grab the gun and move it away. And then we moved in with shields, ballistic shields, and the fire department. And he lived. When I first came on, we would have not been able to do that because we didn't have robots or drones or that capability or ballistic shields and all those sort of things. And very good chance that guy would have died. So even though he shot the officer, it's still, if we can do things to help him survive, and then he can pay for what he's done and hopefully have an opportunity to get better. So there's a lot of progress in terms of technology, tons of progress, but there's still a lot of progress to go. And I will just say this to a certain extent. What I typically say is we have the law enforcement that we want, that at least those in power in society or the people that make the rules or the people that have the most influence, we have law enforcement that those folks want. So during the abolish police movement and the defund police movement, the people that I talked to that wanted to abolish the police, whether it's BLM or any number of other groups, when you ask them, why do you want to abolish the police department? Because the police department has a pretty important role in our communities, at least traditionally. The answer was always, well, because they're built on a history of racism. And, so many hundreds of years of racism and racist activity can't be changed. You got to tear it down to the foundation and rebuild something new. And then typically what they would say is, well, because the police departments originated in slave patrols. Well, so first of all, that's not entirely true. That's true in the South, but it's not true in the North. The modern police departments in the North started as night watchmen, not as slave patrols. But it is true that if you Google slave patrol badge or something like that, their badge does look very similar to the badge that I wore. And in the South, some of the early law enforcement was slave patrols. But my question is this, when that topic comes up, did the slave patrollers create the laws and the rules that said a certain group of people were slaves, and if they ran away, you could capture them and do all sorts of things to them? No, that was lawmakers. Was it the slave patrollers that advertised that a slave ran away and that somebody, here's the reward or whatever to go capture them? No, that was the media. See, society wanted slavery, and society wanted people to go catch slaves. So the early law enforcement was doing what society wants. So if all we do is work on law enforcement, then we're going to fall woefully short. And if we had more time, I could go into more history of how these things came about. I've done probably about almost a decade of research. I'll probably be researching the rest of my life on history. I teach history and implicit bias at college, in community meetings, I'm doing a series at Sacramento County Office of Education on that topic as we speak. So my point being is we've got to work on, all of us, on some of these things that are creating these protests. So now back to the protest. So like I told you earlier, it's the first time an NBA game had been blocked, happened twice. It was the first time, well, not the first time, but as you know, Interstate 5 was blocked. There's a lot of tense moments. There was assaults on officers. There were some violence in the crowds. But what eventually happened is whether it's BLM or just regular community folks, I had nieces and nephews that were part of the protests. After a few weeks to a month, those things kind of died down, or when they did occur, they would happen like from 5 to 8, say, then 8 would come, that group would leave, and groups that were typically like Antifa and Proud Boys would show up. Antifa were typically dressed in ballistic helmets, bulletproof vests. A lot of them would carry backpacks full of rocks. There were vehicles, trucks that would drop off boxes of like river rock at various corners, and they would throw those at the officers. They would throw rocks and bricks at the officers. They would run up to the officers with spray bottles and spray liquid in their face that would make the officer's face burn. But who knows what was in the bottle. They would do all sorts of things like that. And so I had the interesting thing is what the first protests, the Stephon Clark protests and the early George Floyd protests were heavily covered in the news. You couldn't turn on the news without hearing about it. But as those died out and every Saturday battle between Antifa and Proud Boys took place in our city with just as many officers as the earlier protests, like 160 to 200 officers, bringing in officers from Elk Grove and El Dorado County and Yolo County. The media didn't cover those, never. There was one reporter for Cap Public Radio that would come down and cover them and tweet and social media live. He got threatened by the Antifa group that they were going to take his phone and smash it if he didn't stop, tweeting and live shooting. But what was interesting is the media didn't cover those protests. So I called the media and asked them, why were they not covering those protests, even though they covered the earlier protests? Now, mind you, the Antifa versus Proud Boy protests were probably 99% white. They were not diverse groups, neither side. But they came to battle each other. They were doing everything they could to get at each other with our officers standing in the middle. So in those protests and the Antifa protests, I took the stance that, look, I have about 150 officers to cover the whole city, right? The different police stations that were threatened, officers' homes that were threatened, City Hall, all these facilities that were being burnt down in other cities. So we had to guard all those, plus have a contingent of officers where the actual protesters were at that would number anywhere from 300 to 600, 800. And so I decided that unless they're a threat to somebody's safety, unless they're going into a building that they could be lighting on fire or doing any number of things, we are going to monitor. And if a person that did that gets separated from the group, we're going to arrest them. And if not, we will identify them if we can and arrest them a couple days later when they're not with a crowd of 500 people. Because if we move in to this crowd with people with helmets and bulletproof vests, the fight's on. And many people are going to get hurt. Officers are going to get hurt. Protesters are going to get hurt. And it's going to inflame it. And more people are going to come to our city tomorrow night, and buildings are going to burn down like we did in other cities. I did not know if this would work or not. Obviously, I felt very bad for the business owners that had spray paint and broken windows as they had walked by. But our city didn't burn. And they tried to burn our city numerous times, but there's not one building burnt, not one person died. There was several, mild to moderate injuries, but nothing like we saw in the other cities. Even though at the same time, there's politicians saying do one thing, there's the sheriff had a press conference saying how bad the way I handled the protest was, and all these competing interests. And I just had to say, well, I'm going to do what I think is right. And we'll see at the end if it's right. And in hindsight, I think it was, because we didn't have any buildings burnt down. As bad as it was for businesses that would get their windows broke, it's worse if their building burnt. So I think we did the best we could with the resources that we had. And lastly, I want to just say, in terms of leadership and law enforcement, I think one of the things that we need in law enforcement is to ensure that we have leaders that are doing things for the right reason. And although they, in the end, they might have been wrong, but they did it what they thought was right, not for political reasons, not because they have some sort of ideology or anything. But my job is to keep our community safe. My job is to keep our officers safe. You know, I need to be committed to that, period, nothing else. So if you think, one of the things I wanted to end with is, and the moderators can tell me if we have time to play the 6-minute video or we want to just go to Q&A. But back to my point about, we often talk about law enforcement, but law enforcement is, the issues are much bigger than just law enforcement. And if all we do is law enforcement, we're going to continue to fall woefully short. These protests that we've seen over the last couple of years, we often hear that they're unprecedented. They are not. We have had riots in Sacramento before, in Oak Park in the 60s. We have had riots across this country hundreds and hundreds of times. Red Summer in 1919, the Watts riots, the Rodney King riots. And they're all over the same issue of segments of our community don't believe that things are equitable for them. They don't think, you know, employment is fair. They don't think all these things. And then there's some law enforcement action that happens that is like the match on top of that fire, whether it's Rodney King, Stephon Clark, George Floyd, and the list goes on and on and on. The riots in a lot of these other cities throughout time were the spark, the final spark was some sort of egregious law enforcement action that set it off. But if you listen to the protesters, they're saying the same things they were saying 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And so if you even take the recent health order, when I was reading the health order, I realized that everything I did as a kid growing up in Oak Park was illegal. And the people, the powers that be wanted the police department to be the enforcement arm of the health order. So I decided I didn't think that was right, that people that violate the health order be put into the criminal justice system, especially at a time when as a society, we were trying to get people out of the criminal justice system. And so if somebody doesn't wear a mask, should they really get a misdemeanor citation and have a criminal charge if people were standing 5 feet apart instead of 6 feet apart? I did think it was important to enforce the health order, because I thought, well, if doctors are saying we need to do this to stay alive, because if you remember early on in the health order, we didn't have a lot of information about what COVID was. And so I'm like, well, if the doctors say we need to stay away from each other, we should. But now the question is, how do we enforce that? And so my point being to the elected officials at the time was, look, everything I did in my neighborhood was against the law. I played football in the middle of the street, played basketball at McClatchy Park, those sort of things. Went swimming at Sac High's pool in the summertime. All those were illegal per the health order. But obviously it wasn't illegal to swim in your own pool. Well, nobody had their own pool in Oak Park or Del Paso Heights, Meadowview. It was not against the law to go hiking in the foothills. Well, I never left my neighborhood. Me and my friends, we stayed in our neighborhood. We didn't go hiking in the foothills. And it is actually legal to go golf. Well, nobody in my neighborhood went and golfed. And most of our officers are in neighborhoods, the impoverished neighborhoods like Oak Park. So if the police department enforces the health order, one, it's going to be disproportionate because you enforce where you have officers. Otherwise, it doesn't get enforced if there's nobody there to enforce it. So my question was, if, for example, in the African-American community, if the police department, if in our community, the African-American community represents 14% of the population, and at the end of the year, they represent 50% of the citations for violating the health order, I said, what are our leaders going to say? They're going to say that the police department is racist. When in reality, there's an issue with the law and how it's enforced, not necessarily due to solely with a police officer. And so it's those sort of things that if we're going to change, we have to know the history behind things. That's why I teach history. We have to understand how we got to where we're at, how law enforcement got to where it's at, because if we don't understand how we got here, how are we going to change it? And so I think law enforcement has improved a lot. there's require education now, and I think that's helpful. It's really, law enforcement didn't used to be like a professional job, and they really spent a lot of time trying to professionalize the institution of police departments and sheriff's departments to where there's a whole state agency that governs and mandates training, and now there's mandatory mental health training and all sorts of things that evolve over time. We still have a long ways to go. There's still a lot of mistrust of law enforcement in segments of our community. But what you see in the survey that the police department does every year is some neighborhoods have 80, 90% trust in the police department. And other neighborhoods have like 18%. It's the same police department in the same city, but it varies that widely based on what neighborhood you live in. And so there's a much different relationship with the police department depending on where you live. And until we change that, until we have a more even trust level across the city, regardless of what neighborhood you have, then we're going to continue to see these challenges. And I'll end on this and open it up to questions because I don't know that we have time to play the video. But I guess if you're all on email, it can be emailed to you. It's just a video about the protests. So until we all collectively, not just law enforcement, until we all start looking at the real issues and trying to solve the real issues, we're going to continue to do this. And one of the reporters asked me in my last week as police chief in December if I thought we would ever have protests like what we had seen over the last couple of years again. And I said, yes, I do, because I don't know how much we're doing to not have them, because we're only concentrating on law enforcement. We have to concentrate on our entire city. Del Paso Heights can't look like Del Paso Heights in the future if we don't want these protests. Oak Park can't look like Oak Park if we don't want these protests. We have to start changing lives, not just solely focusing on, say, law enforcement. And law enforcement needs to do a lot more. I mean, if you had told me that we would be wearing body cameras when I came on in the 80s, if you had said at some point in the future, we'll all have body cameras on and we're going to release that video and everybody's going to be able to see, I would have said you were crazy. There's no way that will ever happen. And now we're doing that. And I think in the long run, that's a good thing to do, because people get to see actually what happened and get to make their own judgments as best they possibly can, as opposed to only listening to what people say and having to make their judgments based on what a police chief says, or they can watch the video and make their own judgments of what they think. So with that, I'd be happy to open it up to questions. And I think Chris has the video, so feel free to email it to everybody if people want.
Yeah, I'll do that, Daniel. And for now, we're going to have Eileen take some questions out of the Q&A, and then we'll do the Del Norte Hall, some questions from that.
Okay.
So Eileen, you can put on your video and go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I have quite a few questions here, and I will ask two of them, and then I'll go to the live audience, and we'll see how far we get. Let's see here. There were a couple of them about bean bags. I'm going to put them together as one. It says, would you please describe the bean bag shotgun, and when is the decision made to use it? And then how effective is a shotgun with bean bags in a dangerous confrontation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I often hear the same question about tasers and the other less lethal force. So a beanbag shotgun, it looks just like a regular shotgun, except you'll see them either bright orange or bright yellow, which means they're a less, what we call less lethal shotgun. So it can't shoot a regular shotgun round. And a beanbag is basically a bag that's, you know, if you made an OK symbol with your hand, it's about the size of the circle in between your thumb and your pointer finger. And now I think they have little tails on them, so they're more accurate, so they don't float around. But if you're within, you know, maybe 10, 15 yards of somebody, it hurts, and it will often knock somebody down. And basically what the hope is that it, you know, it stuns somebody long enough for the officers to get up and grab them and put them in handcuffs, kind of thing. So in the circumstances that they would be used is if somebody maybe is violent, but they don't have a gun, maybe they have a knife, And so you'd only use it if you had somebody else with you that had a lethal weapon, like a handgun. Because if it doesn't work and they're charging at you with a knife, then you now have a knife in you. So that's what all those pieces of equipment are used for. So there's a lot of times there'll be somebody with a knife or a bat or a club, something that can't shoot you from a distance. And they'll either get tased or hit with a beanbag or a 40 millimeter, which is like a hard rubber, like a little mini baton thing that the officers have. And it will bring the situation to an end. And so they might have a little bruise on them, but they're alive. So that's what they're used for.
Okay, another question is, what about social workers under police department employment on emergency calls? Question mark. I think there may be one full-time social worker in the SAC PD. Can we increase the numbers so there is someone available on a regular basis?
Yeah, I started the social services division when I was in Roseville that had, for the first time and the only time in this country that I know of in a police department that has that, where officers actually work for a social worker, not a lieutenant or a sergeant or something like that. And then I brought that same person actually to Sacramento when I came back to Sac. And so Bridget Dean, was a manager in the Sacramento Police Department over the social services division that dealt with mental health and homeless issues. That position no longer exists in the police department. The city created Department of Community Response, DCR, and so she became the director of that. So I do think that we need to like blur or eliminate the line between different functions of government, if you will. So like we need to blur the line between social work and the police department. The issue I typically see with that is people want all of one or all of the other. So there's people that, oh, I don't want the police department to respond at all. I only want a social worker. Or there's other people that go, I don't want no social worker to respond. I want the police to respond. I think both are wrong. So many situations require both to respond. And what ideally, I think when we get there, this is the ideal situation. If there's any sort of possibility of violence, you need to have a police officer respond. And once that violence is dealt with, then the social workers can take over and the police officers can actually leave and go do other things that only police officers can do. And I think when we have that like seamless kind of transitions and working together as one big unit, not this competition of, you know, you're trying to take my job or those sort of things, I think that's when we'll be able to provide a much better service to the community. We're getting there in the city of Sacramento, but we're not all the way there where it's this seamless, you know, whatever this person needs or this group of people needs in our community, we can get it to them like that. Because the reality is with mental health or drug addiction, you can't hand somebody a card and say, call on Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? When they're ready, you need to have those resources there now.
Okay, thank you. I'll let the audience, the live audience, have some of their questions.
Okay, we have a question here. Hi, I spent a really great childhood raised by a man who retired from the San Diego Police Department at 30 years service. I remember the old days of what I heard and what I knew. I want to know, how do you feel about severely reduced penalties, catch and release of a lot of things that we used to think should require more, and reducing the number of prisons we have in California?
Yeah, another great question. I think we have a problem in this country that we've always had, right? We go from one extreme to the other, and we never stop in the middle where, like, if you will, the sweet spot or where I think we should be. So if you think back when I was growing up and when the crack epidemic took place in the 80s and early 90s, that's where 3 strikes came about. That's where zero tolerance came about, and this really heavy police presence in our neighborhoods. And people say that wasn't successful. That's not true. It was wildly successful. It dropped crime for decades to some of the lowest points crime has ever been in our country. But it also did something detrimental. It furthered the divide in those communities between law enforcement and the community. And it eroded the little bit of trust that might have been there before. And so once crime dropped so drastically over decades and people aren't feeling like the weight of crime anymore, right? They feel safe. They don't feel like they're going to get robbed or beat or burglarized every 2 seconds. Then we decide we're going to let everybody out, which is where we've been a few years back. And if you see right now, crime starting and defund the police, and there's a lot of other things mixed in there this time with COVID and all these other things. But then crime starts going back up. And so now if you listen, people are starting to get scared of crime. And so they want more police. They want zero tolerance. They want, you know, some of these harsher measures. So back to the other extreme. When the reality is we need to be in the middle. There are people in prison and jail that I don't believe need to be there if they had the right resources and the right assistance. But the other reality is there are people that need to be in jail and in prison. If you let them out, I can guarantee you somebody's going to get hurt, right? It's just that's just reality. There are some really bad actors that do some really heinous crimes. And we've gotten to the point over the last couple of years that some of those people we let out because we're just this blanket, people shouldn't be in jail, or COVID, so everybody's zero bail and all those things. And we've seen some murders in our city. The Lamb Park, Miss Tibbetts was murdered by a man that was a parolee at large. He should have been in jail. And so, because he wasn't, well, at least part of why he wasn't, it's his, I mean, he did it. So it's on him. But if he was in jail, it wouldn't have happened. And her brothers and family would still have her. So I do think that we've gone too far, and I do think we're going to go back too far the other way, and we're well on our way there now. And then crime will eventually go back down, then we'll come all the way back to where we've been over the last couple of years, unless our leaders decide that, look, we have people in prison that if we give them the right resources and we do the right things, that maybe they don't need to be there. Because I've always recognized that had my mom and dad not adopted me and I grew up in foster care, bounced around from home to home. So just that one thing, even though it was a large thing, the one thing of me being adopted by who I was adopted by enabled me to be here talking to you today, enabled me to do all the things that I've done. Had that not been the case, I might be that person sitting in prison. And so some people are there because they've had some really bad circumstances that maybe they didn't handle so well. And with the right assistance and the right help, they can be productive people in our community. So I do think we've gone too far. We always do. And I work every day. Part of the reason why I teach history is to show, look, we've done this before and we know the results. So let's not do it again.
Yes, I should identify myself, Sigrid Bothan. I'm a journalist and I cover mental health issues, healthcare, and the intersection with the correctional system for many publications, currently a series for Capital Weekly. I'd like to return a little bit. I mean, you had a tremendous record in the police department in Roseville and in Sacramento, bringing Bridget Dean in to head the mental health unit. And we're still seeing a huge issue on the streets. The governor's care court plan is touted as possibly helping to change that. I covered conditions in the state hospitals, and nobody wants to go back to that. But we certainly don't want the jails and prisons, which are now being called the new asylums. And I know this is a huge, broad topic, but if you have any comments on how local law enforcement, with the assistance of social workers, not reducing police presence, but adding to it in a collaborative process, how can that be brought into play in more police departments in California? Thank you.
Yeah, I do believe we need more officers in Sacramento. We're one of the lowest staffed police departments in the country. But I think the thing that we're lacking the most is resources, whether they're mental health resources, drug rehab resources. And I really feel like if we really want to make a difference in a lot of these things, we have to have more robust resources that people can get into immediately. That they're, if somebody's ready to go right now, we can take them there, or somebody can take them there. And, you see the homeless situation seems to be getting worse by the day. And a lot of that has mental health and drugs related to it. And, if we go back to arresting everybody, I can take that person to jail every day. But if they don't, if we don't have resources to make better their drug issues and their mental health issues, well, the minute they walk out of the front door of the jail, they still are addicted and they still have unaddressed mental health issues. So I'll just be taking them to jail again tomorrow. So we're not really making much headway. I'm always interested in long-term solutions. So, and I've seen it work. I've seen people that I'm friends with people. Matter of fact, one guy that did 10, 11 years in prison spoke at my retirement ceremony. I know many people that have been to prison that are doing great right now. And I just don't think we listen to them enough. We ask, you know, might be like people like me, what it takes for somebody coming out of 20 years of prison. Well, I'll give you my opinion, but I've never been to prison. When I teach at CDCR history and implicit bias, and I remember I was talking, well, I talked to every class, but this one particular class I was talking about, do your experiences match the experiences of the communities that you serve? Well, obviously one of the communities that correctional officers serve, or the correction system serves, are inmates, or people that are in custody. And so I said, do you have experience of being in prison for 20 years? I mean, you can't even be a police officer if you've got a felony on your record. So my guess is no. And so they all said no, except one person said, no, I do, because I've worked in a prison for 20 years. And so before I could even say anything, one of his fellow correction members said, do you go home at the end of the night, or does the jail cell close behind you? And he said, well, of course I go home. And so she says, then you don't have the experience of being in prison for 20 years. And so I know it can happen. Not everybody it can happen with, but we need a better system of seeing who's the bigger threat to our society, and then what resources can we put to help that person reintegrate back into the community in a successful way, as opposed to often the way we do it now, where we open the prison door after 20 years, give you $200 and say, good luck.
Okay, I will.
Do I?
You want me to go ahead?
Okay.
I'll
Yeah.
ask one. I'm going to combine two questions, and then you, Mr. Hahn, you have to let us know when you want to quit. So these are two questions somewhat related. One from Michelle. What specific changes are being made to the impoverished neighborhoods to improve police confidence? And the other one, let me get to the bottom here. What actions or outreach is now reaching in your old neighborhoods, I guess, in South Sacramento to the youth to enter police positions? It's not quite related, but sort of.
Yeah. So there's a lot of efforts around the country. You know, you'll see cops and coffee. I think cops and coffee type things, National Night Out is a more robust kind of thing. I think those are fine, but the community that doesn't trust the police department doesn't come to cops and coffee. They just don't, right? And so, yeah, it's nice that the cops are out in the community at the Starbucks or whatever and interacting with community. That's great. I'm not saying end those, but that's not the answer. So we have to, you know, if you think about who you trust in your life, it's somebody that you've probably known for a while. It's somebody that you've probably gone through some good and bad issues with. And so that's, you know, that's why I felt part of my job as a police chief is how do I get officers and community together outside of a call per se, so we can build trust and learn about each other, get to know each other. And if you see in those studies that I read at the very beginning of this session, the people that are trusted some of the highest are the actual local neighborhood officers that work their specific neighborhood. My guess is because they know them, because they've seen them, they see them all the time, they probably talk to them, those sort of things. So they have a higher level of trust. So those are the things that departments need to do. The police department's doing them. It makes it harder when you have lower staffing, because then really all you're doing is going from call to call to call. But those are the things that need to happen, different ways of connecting with, you know, community and officers. There's programs like the one I started at Grant, at Kennedy, at McClatchy, at Johnson. Those are like ROTC programs, but for law enforcement. So those actually do result in some of those students going into law enforcement. But until the groups that the main groups that are not represented in law enforcement are women who, there was never a woman police officer in the Sacramento region until 1974. So, because we didn't, as a society, we didn't believe women could be police officers. It wasn't until 1911 that we voted and allowed women to vote in California, because we didn't believe women were capable or strong enough or whatever to vote. And the newspapers wrote editorials about why women shouldn't vote in 1911. So the groups that are not represented or are represented the least in law enforcement are women, African-American, and sort of Hispanic, right? Well, it's a male-dominated profession, and we have all these biases about what women can and can't do. And so I think there's still a lot of people that think women shouldn't be in law enforcement. So if you're a woman, you have extra challenges in being in law enforcement. And if you look at the Black community, they have the least amount of trust in law enforcement. So why would they want to be in law enforcement? And we do that to each other too. I've been called Uncle Tom many, many times from the Black community. Coon, sellout, all those sort of things. So we have work to do, not just in recruiting, but to change the relationship between our community and law enforcement if we want to start doing better at recruiting in general and better at recruiting the underrepresented groups.
You know, I want to thank you. I thought it was a great presentation. I'm really glad I heard you today. And I want to talk about one of the solutions that some people say are solutions that I think are the scary solutions. There's a whole lot more guns out there, and some people feel more guns is the answer. And in fact, I heard somebody talking yesterday that actually talked about people in Congress trying to get national laws passed to have a nationwide open carry law. And I don't know if you can imagine that kind of Wild West, that when you start having the reaction to this of more people carrying guns and things like open carry laws, which are proliferating in other states, not in California. You wouldn't think it happened. They'd like to think they could get the votes to have it happen nationwide someday. But I wonder if you could comment about the guns that are out there and the reactions of some people say the answer is for good people to carry guns.
Well, that's actually been one of the major changes also since I started. There are a lot more legally carried guns in our community now than before. If you think just like the Sheriff's Department is the primary concealed weapon permit issuer in our county. And when I first came on, and for most of my career, the sheriff's take on that, and all the sheriffs across the country for that matter, oftentimes was you must show a reason to need to conceal carry, right? Maybe you were threatened, or maybe you're a business owner that carries a large amount of cash away from your business at 2 in the morning or something like that. Well, you'll see it in the sheriff races now. One of the debate questions will be, how do you feel about CCWs? Is it a right to get a CCW so you don't have to show a need? And so our sheriff's department has, for the last 2 sheriffs, issued CCWs without a reason. So there's a way more CCWs in our community now than there was before. I don't think so, but I'm glad you asked that question, because often our solution to the rise in violent crime is this debate about guns. And especially in California, this debate about we need more gun laws. And I do agree that I agree. I think we need more gun laws too. I think we should ban guns that hold 1 billion rounds and can shoot them in a half a second. I don't see any reason for those sort of weapons. But we're never going to ban guns completely in our country. It's never going to happen. But I also don't believe, even if we did some additional things in our country that I believe would be good, not allow these high-powered, tons of rounds. I mean, it is not unusual to find 150 round, those drum barrel magazines in a handgun, which there's no way you can control a fully automatic handgun with 150 rounds strapped onto the bottom of it. I mean, that thing's going to spray rounds everywhere. But even if we did that, we'd still have a lot of this violent crime. If you think about the mass shooting that happened at 10th and K, where 6 people died, the guns that were used in that were already illegal. They're already illegal. So when a reporter asked me that, I go, what do you want, make it double illegal? Like, they were already illegal to possess, and they used them anyway. So although I think there is some good discussion that could happen around, do we need additional gun laws for certain things? I do agree that that needs to take place or should take place, but I also recognize that's not the solution. That's just a little tiny piece that will not stop the violence the way we want it to stop, that we need to work on other things in addition to that. I'll just say this, unfortunately, some people, that is the solution, right? We just need some more gun laws and this violence will go away. I can promise you that's not true.
Mr. Hahn, thank you so much on behalf of the audience here in Del Norte Hall on campus. We really appreciate your time and what a wonderful, informative presentation. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.